Globalization and cultural hegemony. The case of the Theyyams of Marakkappu. Any discussion on globalization invariably leads to a discussion of cultural hegemony, the cultural hegemony of the West, particularly of the USA. Globalization is depicted as a destructive force which takes upon itself the mission of wiping out marginalized cultures to create a unique cultural world. There is an invariable counterposing of Western and non-Western marginalized cultures in such discussions. It is asserted that Western cultural hegemony can be resisted only by invoking the vitality of the indigenous culture. An article by Jeanette Armstrong, the Canadian First Nation writer and activist, on the effects of globalization on her Okanagan community can be taken as a symptomatic instance. There are a number of issues which such a discussion throws up. The first being what constitutes culture. The second, whether cultural hegemony in itself is an agenda of processes of globalization, past and present, or whether it is incidental to economic and political hegemony. A third, and perhaps the most important, whether tolerance to cultural practices of marginalized communities is advantageous to the economic forces of globalization. The predominant view of culture today limits the signification of the word to works of art, customs and rituals, food and dress, and the micro-politics of everyday exchanges, including the use of language. The economic life of a community seldom figures in discussion on culture, although it does when the more inclusive term civilization is used, but always with reference to ancient peoples. Thus, one scarcely hears of the British destruction of Indian culture when the British colonial policies which completely destroyed India's world-renowned cloth manufacturing industry are mentioned. Discussions on whether China's cultural revolution of 1966-76 was really cultural is also related to this narrow view of culture. Stephen Greenblatt, the guru of New Historicism, stood wonderstruck before a Coca-Cola stand near an archaeological site at Coba in Mexico, where the ruins of Mayan culture were being excavated. He was amazed by the Mayan archaeological principles employed in the construction of the stand. Greenblatt writes with apparent excitement, despite frequent colonial attempts to drive them or imagine them out of existence, the Maya have not in fact vanished, and a single entrepreneur's architectural improvisation suddenly had more resonance for me than the mounds of the lost city. This thunderously loud resonance lost on Greenblatt is the in this thunderously loud resonance. What is lost on Greenblatt is the appropriation of Mayan culture by global capital. To inquire whether anything of the Mayan economic practices have survived in modern Mexico would, of course, be asking too much. What has struck this author as a more significant survival of a cultural practice can be observed in many hotels, especially in the rural areas of Malabar. Most hotels serve fish curry along with rice. But except in the branded hotels, which are a class by themselves, only the early customers get pieces of fish with their curry, the rest having to be satisfied with the gravy, while they all pay the same amount for the lunch. It's also not unusual that customers are surprised by generous helpings of fish when there is a lull in custom, often during a strike by workers or government employees. The practice has survived the onslaught of global capital, which claims to offer no free lunch, but value for every paisa spent by the customers. John Ralston Saul notes that the entire thrust of the present globalization movement, which began in the early 70s, was in making economics a religion, and that it completely ignored cultural diversity as a factor which had to be reckoned with. One can find that when it got around to dealing with cultural diversity in Europe, multiculturalism was adopted as a policy. All administrative documents of the European Union are today translated into more than 25 languages, not just into prominent languages like English, French, or German, as was the practice, but also into several languages like Finnish, which are spoken by populations of less than 5 million. There has also been a marked shift in the language policy in America. The people are today encouraged to learn, besides Spanish, a number of Asian and African languages, including numerically or politically significant languages like Hindi and Arabic. Cartoons about George Bush's efforts to learn Hindi appeared in several North Indian dailies in the first week of January 2006. Already, multinational companies have spent billions of dollars for culturally sensitive advertisements in hundreds of languages of the world. A rustic Amir Khan hauls up bottles of Coca-Cola for two village damsels speaking in Hindi. A parda-clad woman speaks enthusiastically about the latest brand of washing machine that arrived in the market. Money speaks the same language everywhere. As long as the cash counters keep ringing, cultural relativity can be accommodated, or more importantly, exploited. It may also be possible to measure the economic success of globalizations of the past in terms of tolerance to marginalized cultures. In fact, European colonial empires from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries can be taken as symptomatic instances. The level of economic success of British, French, Spanish, and Portuguese colonial empires in Asia, Africa, and Latin America can be related to the extent to which they tolerated indigenous cultures. At least in India, one of the hallmarks of British colonial rule after 1858 was the hands-off policy towards the religious practice of Indians. Ambikasuthan Mangad's novel Markkappile Theyyangal, The Theyyams of Marakkappu, brings into perspective for the first time in Malayalam literature the dynamics of economics and culture in a community over which the juggernaut of global capital is rolling on. The epilogue sets the tone for the ambiguous positions towards cultural traditions the narration takes the reader to. The narrator, with a bachelor's degree in literature, owns a drugstore in town. Lawrence, his classmate in college, had become an activist, organizing residents of Marakkappu beach against the tourism development projects funded by global capital, which were set to destroy both the environment and their livelihood. Lawrence is murdered, and the needle of suspicion points to the district administration, which was pursuing the tourism project enthusiastically. Lawrence's death takes the narrator on a journey of inquiry into Marakkappu beach and the lives of its inhabitants, to which he had never before given a thought. As he returns from his first visit to Marakkappu at nightfall, he hears strains of Totem, the hymns for the Theyyams, from a temple in the distance, which sets him on a nostalgic reverie. The narration alternates between valorization of the indigenous culture and its incisive critique. While the totems for the Theyyams, dead men or women returning as spirits, evoke both nostalgia and anguish, the Theyyams who appear on the ramparts of the Kamballur fort are not the fierce demonic entities depicted in performances by the traditional artists. They often laugh wryly at their own marginalization and watch with amusement the new tourism project unfolding before their eyes. Passages which parody Chemmin, the first novel about the fishing community in Malayalam, heighten the ambiguity and irony. Illusions about the pristine innocence of indigenous cultures are shattered early in the novel when both children and grown-ups rail at a run-down European tourist couple at the beach. Later, the widow's bath ritual that Umbichi is forced to take after her husband's death demonstrates that tribal or semi-tribal cultures can be as ruthlessly patriarchal as any other. The Theyyams prove powerless to stop the appropriation of the fishing community's land. Lawrence's death was a setback for the movement, which resisted the appropriation of land for the tourist project, from which it could never recover. Bulldozers demolish the huts, and the whole community is uprooted. The tourist resort takes over the ghost town. But when the novel ends, there is consolation for historians of culture who exult in the survival of cultural icons of marginalized communities. Every structure in the tourist resort is built in traditional architectural design. There is a small wood in the resort in which trees and medicinal herbs native to the Western Ghats grew in abundance. In the theatre built in the traditional style of a Kuthambalam, Theyyam artists performed every evening. It's an eerie world where culture has survived as a commodity, but not the people who created it. Of course, the smug nonchalance of the designer culture is ruffled when one of the artists throws himself down from the ramparts, breaks his drum, and breaks into tears. The novelist could not obviously allow global capital to have the last laugh. Let me end this essay with a question. Was Stephen Greenblatt, like many intellectuals today, being an apologist for global capital without realizing it when he exulted in the survival of Mayan architecture in the Coca-Cola stand?